Hello everyone and welcome to my patch 25.23 tier list. Now it's been a very long time since I made one of these, so I'm going to go through every single mid laner and talk about them each individually, which will all be timestamped in the description below. First though, I do want to give my general thoughts on the meta so that you guys kind of understand how the game works right now and what things you might want to prioritize. So the general mid meta at the moment is largely focused on scaling and 5v5s. It kind of used to be in the past that laning phase and early game was the most important, and then if you had scaling, it was a bonus. I think now it's kind of the other way around. It's like scaling and 5v5 potential is the most important, and then if you also happen to be a strong skirmisher and a strong laner, which some of the overpowered champions are, that's a really nice bonus. But I think champions that are only strong in the early game and that do fall off tend not to be that good, and you might be wondering why scaling and stuff is so OP, and there's a few reasons. One is that Akali is extremely broken, right? So like being strong at the 20-minute period of the game is really important. Also, that tends to be around when you're contesting for third dragon, which again, Dragon Sol obviously is very strong, and there's the potential to get both Akali and third dragon back to back, which is pretty much going to instantly win you the game. So I think like scaling into the ultra late game, you know, like 40 minutes or whatever, isn't too important, but definitely champions that are strong and probably like the, I want to say like 18 to maybe like 25-minute mark are very strong, because you can pick up those really key objectives and you can set up for Baron. You still can play full scaling champs, but you definitely want to be careful playing full scaling at the cost of early game, and you'll kind of see that there's a lot of champions that are going to be high up on this list that are very strong both in the early game, but also scale really well and have great 5v5. There's a couple other things I want to mention. So burst champions are kind of a little weak right now, and it's not actually because assassins or whatever are bad, but it's because the burst itemization is quite weak, especially AP burst. So you're gonna see champions like LeBlanc or whatever that are normally solo queue terrors like a little bit lower down than usual, and again, it's less because the champions are bad and more because like the itemization is just not particularly favorable. Like it's really easy to neutralize these champions. There's a lot of things like Catalyst or Bone Plating that can help neutralize the lane, and then Matter Resist is very overtuned against these things. The assassins that tend to be high up on the list are going to be ones that aren't reliant on burst builds, and you actually see this a lot from AD assassins. You see them going for more like bruiser focused builds, like I think Zed's a really good example of this, and you'll see Zed very high on my tier list. The last thing I want to mention before I actually start the tier list is my method of blind picking has changed quite a lot. Now I will talk about blind picks kind of as I talk about the champions, but I will put a specific section at the end just talking about mid lane blind picks. So if you want to skip to that, you can. But the reason my method of blind picking has changed is because I think that dying matters a lot less than before. So basically what I used to do is I would always blind a champ with a dash, because that way if they did draft some sort of composition that had a lot of threat, you know, so things like Jarvan or Rala or, you know, whatever, I would have the tools to deal with it. But nowadays I kind of go for more greedy blinds, and the reason is, yeah, the dying just like doesn't matter so much. At least dying outside of key windows doesn't matter so much. So overall, I would say gold leads are definitely not what they used to be, and that's because there's just so much invisible power and objectives. You know, again, things like Akali are insanely broken, and it's more dying on key timings that are really bad. And I'll actually give you guys some examples, and it's something that frustrates me quite a lot. Like if you die at, let's say, 18 minutes 30, and there's no dragon up and there's no Akali up or whatever, that death could be pretty much irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. Like, yeah, it's 300 gold, but it's really not that bad. On the other hand, if you die at like 1945, you know, 15 seconds before Akali spawns, that's probably game over. You probably lost. And the reason that frustrates me is because you made the same mistake, right? So like, I think you should be punished somewhat accordingly, obviously, or proportionally. Obviously, it's going to be different, right? Because there's objectives up and stuff. But the punishment for dying at the wrong time is like way worse than just dying randomly. So when games used to be super snowbally, it was just nice to have a dash all the time to make sure you don't die. But nowadays, I think it's, again, just way more important to be as strong as possible for the 5v5, and so I just prefer to go for these greedy blinds that if I don't get punished, I'm just going to scale ridiculously hard, and even if the early game goes somewhat bad, I'm still going to scale and end up being strong at 20 minutes. So I think it should say something when kind of the early game goblin that, you know, I used to take like full early game all the time has kind of become a scaling warlord just because of how the meta has become. But that's my general thoughts on blind picking. Anyway, I'll get a little more in depth on the champions themselves later in the video. Now, let's start with the champions. One thing I want to say about the tiers really quick is that I don't really think there's any champions mid that are truly terrible. The thing is though, like things that are in lower tier often can be very powerful, but it's more that they can be used less often. You know, like a champion in S tier, you can pick like pretty much every game and it's going to be very strong. Champions in B tier, they might be really good situationally, but chances are if you like one trick them or whatever, they're not going to be that powerful. So just want to kind of put that out there. Now, Ahri. So Ahri's been the queen of solo queue forever, but I think these days she's not as good. So she's still a very solid A tier, like the champion is good, right? Like, I don't think you can go wrong with playing Ahri, but there's definitely a few downsides to her. So the main problems are she definitely isn't as consistent a scaler or team fighter, which does hurt her a little bit in the meta. And there's also a lot of really powerful laners that can, you know, shut Ahri down and make it difficult for her to play the mid-jungle support 3v3. Still, though, she is super well-rounded, you know, very hard to punish. She got sustain, got wave clear, got a lot of dashes. And if you just want a champion in your pool, especially to deal with compositions or whatever that are just really, really punishing, right? Like if you do see a bunch of stuff that locks down immobility, right? I always say things like Jarvan, Rel, or Leona, or whatever, you know, like that's the kind of game you might want to think about Ahri. She can be blind picked for sure, but like I said, I do prefer the greedy blind. So pretty good champ overall. Akali, I think, is more of a B+ these days. So my main issue with Akali, there's a couple actually. So first off, AP itemization, like I said at the start, AP burst itemization is kind of weak, and I think it's quite easy to neutralize Akali. That being said, she does have some good matchups into some of the stronger champions. So like she can be kind of good just exclusively used as a counter pick. She's good against melee, she's kind of good against skill shot mages, but the changes to D-Shield Second Wind definitely made it a little more punishing, and like I said, the inconsistency and the lack of scaling I think punishes her quite a bit. So if you're going to use Akali, I'd really recommend using her as a counter pick. Akshan, I think, deserves an A+. So the thing with Akshan is he's a really powerful laner, which is great, but he also scales well because he is just a crit 80 carry. And he's going to be very, very good in pretty much any skirmish that you have early. I will say that it can be difficult to teamfight on this champ into certain comps. Like if you're against like a bunch of CC or whatever, it can be really hard. And there are a couple matchups that are really difficult. Like I think Syndra's a big one, but you can just ban that, and it's a pretty good ban at the moment as well. So I think Akshan is, you know, I mean, I think everyone kind of knows this champion is really, really aids to play against the solo queue, but I do think it's really, really powerful. And since there is a shortage of AD mids that are viable, if you are looking for a really good AD mid, this can definitely be one of your options. Speaking of AD mids, I think Ambessa is one of the best mid lane counter picks at the moment, so it is still kind of annoying to blind pick Ambessa because she can be punished a little bit by range, and she does struggle a little bit against like dashes and phase rush and stuff, but the thing is, Ambessa is just an insanely broken champion. She is definitely better in top than mid in terms of pickability, but if you're playing her mid, you gain the flex pick potential, and also chances are your opponent just doesn't really know what Ambessa does, or if they do, like they don't know the limits that well. So this is a super, super strong champion, and if you want to learn something as an AD meta, again, it's a great option. It's particularly good, I think, against other melees. Like, it's very, very difficult for the mid lane melees to trade back against, right? Like, unless you're playing something really, really strong like Renekton, typically Ambessa's going to bully them out, and the scaling is just absolutely ridiculous. So one of the best champions just all around for solo queue at the moment, and definitely should be high up on the list. Anivia has started to become more and more popular, and I think one of the really big things about that is people have kind of figured out how to build Anivia. So you kind of saw, like, there's a lot of people that still play Roa and Seraphs on Anivia. I definitely don't think that's very good. It like slows down your build just so much, and like all the extra tankiness actually isn't really required because you do just have the ability to kite people out. Like against short range or melee comps are really, really strong. The phase rush and all the slows and stuns in your kit just make life super easy. Like you really don't need the tank stats. So when I see Anivias go something like Roa, Seraph, Zhonya, I just know they're going to be useless. But typically what people do is they drop one of those. So the most common build that I see is going like Roa, Liandry, and then from there you can kind of build, you know, situationally depending on what you want. I would just say like don't build so defensively, but the champion is really, really good at the Atacon fight, and there are a lot of melees in other roles, right? Like the junglers are mainly AD bruisers, right? Things like Xin Zhao, and the supports typically are, I mean, not always, but I'd say like they tend to favor melee supports, things like Nautilus, Rel, Leona, and Anivia is just so good into these. The big downside of Anivia is she can struggle against other mages in the meta. Now, because you build Catalyst, you can kind of neutralize these. Like, Catalyst is really, really strong. I still think she is better used as a counter pick, right? Like, you probably want to counter her either into a matchup where you know that, like, you're going to, you know, make their life really difficult. And a good example would be if you're playing Anivia into a melee or into, like, Cassiopeia or, you know, something short range, I think it can be really, really good. Or you can blind pick Anivia mid, having seen that the majority of the enemy comp is short range. And that way, you know, even if your matchup is bad, you'll be really, really good compositionally. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of Annie these days, so Annie, I think, suffers from the AP burst plague, which is that your items are just not that good. It's too easy to counter flat penetration. So, I think the best build is just going something like Malignant Shadow Flame or Malignant Storm Surge or whatever. And unless you're solo AP, it's quite hard to play these builds. I will say that in lower elos, people tend to build less Magic Resist, which can definitely make this more powerful. And I think if they don't build Magic Resist, Annie's actually really good, right? Because her lane is pretty nice. You've got very strong lane, especially at 6. You can just all in with the Bear and Electrocute. Very, very hard to trade back against. And you are good at all these like straight up 5v5s and skirmishes and stuff, but like I said, the itemization holds her back, and if you're in a game where you're forced to build something like Rylai or Leandra, you definitely feel pretty low value. So I don't know, this is probably a pick that in lower elos when people aren't building Magic Resist is probably pretty high tier, but I think as you go up the ladder, it definitely falls off a little bit, mostly because of the prevalence of Magic Resist. I will squeeze Asol into the bottom of A tier. So I think Asol's a pretty underrated champ in general. His scaling is really, really good. I think he's got good items, and he does have tools to neutralize bad matchups. That being said, it's still a very, very greedy champion to pick, because a lot of the champions that actually do counter Asol or that can punish him scale very well themselves. Like if you blind something like Asol and you get met with Syndra, it's like, okay, does Syndra scale as well as Asol? Definitely not quite, but it's not that far behind, and for how miserable your early game is going to be, it just doesn't really feel worth it. So I kind of see Asol's, like, you've got to use him as a counter pick, and admittedly, he does counter some champs that are used, like Azir and Victor and stuff, but it just feels like that counter pick slot is already so valuable. There's some champions that just, like, completely destroy entire enemy compositions, things like Anivia, so I just don't think he's quite in the same, ballpark as those, but he is a really good champ. Like, I think he definitely deserves to be an A tier, and his scaling alone, especially in lower elos, is going to mean that you can turn some, like, totally doomed games into some LP games. Aurora is a champ I have pretty mixed feelings on. So good things about Aurora, she's great in the meta. She's got a really strong lane, she's good at skirmishing, she's great in the big 5v5, she has mobility, so she's a very, very well-rounded champion overall. I think the biggest thing with Aurora is that, kind of similar to a champ like Annie, she can be a little like hamstrung by her itemization. So if you're solo AP as Aurora and you get to build something like Luden's Shadow Flame or Malignant Shadow Flame or whatever, this champ is ridiculously strong and will still scale into the late game. That being said, if you're playing like duo AP or triple AP, obviously you will fall off massively by building flat pen, but the problem is that if you go for some other build, like let's say you play like Blackfire Cosmic or something, you just don't feel anywhere near as impactful. Like you don't have as much impact early, and then you don't scale as well as, some of the actual scaling champs like Taliyah or Syndra or whatever, and the fights late game can definitely feel pretty tough against them. So I think the way I'd see it is, if you're going to play Aurora every game, she's probably right about here. She's probably very similar to Ahri. If you're going to pick Aurora when you're only like solo AP, right, or you don't think they're going to build Magic Resist because they're all squishy or something, then she's probably an A+, probably about here. But I think, again, most of you guys are probably going to be one-tricking or two-tricking or whatever. I think I'll put her at the very top of A tier. Azir is a pretty controversial one, and I think I'll put him in the middle of A tier. So I think it's pretty undeniable that Azir post first item is ridiculously broken, but there is a whole 10-minute period before that, and while it's true that early game doesn't matter quite as much as it did before, it's like, does Azir scale well enough to make up for, having that really weak early game? And the answer is kind of. Like, I think Azir's itemization choices are really, really good. You can build basically whatever you want after your first item, right? Like things like Shadow Flame for your solo AP are really good. It's much easier to buy an early Void or an early Death Cap on this champion and still to feel good. Things like Zhonya and stuff can be very, very powerful. You've got Rylai and Leandri's as options, so you really can build whatever you want. But the weaknesses come from the early lane can be pretty tough, especially laning against things like Ori or Syndra or Victor. Particularly in solo queue when you're not going to receive as many ganks. Like Azir has a lot of gank setup, but often it doesn't get played around as much as it does champs like Ahri or whatever. So for most of you watching, I'd say Azir, for his difficulty, both in terms of like mechanical difficulty, but also in the game plan of like, okay, you really need to slow down the early game for the first 10 minutes and get to Nashor, and then you've got to play the fights from there. I'd say for most of you watching, Azir is probably pretty low tier. There's just much easier things to play. But I think objectively, the champion is quite strong. And if you put the time into Azir, like, you definitely be well rewarded. The champion is super busted. It just, yeah, it needs some kind of, not specific conditions in terms of champ select or whatever, but it has a very narrow game plan that you have to follow. And if you make mistakes, like if you do die to an early gank or you choose a wrong fight or whatever, your game can get very derailed and then you just don't feel that impactful. Now, I am actually going to put Brand mid on this tier list. I think if you're below Diamond or so, he's probably an A+. This is a really, really good champ for lower elos, just because he's so easy to have impact on. In fact, like, you can die 10 times on this champ and still be the most impactful player in the game, probably for both teams, just because his CC and his damage output is absolutely ridiculous. So one of the best mids that you can pick up if you are in lower elos, and the itemization flexibility is really nice too. Like, in bad matchups, you can easily rush something like Rylai. It's very cheap, gives you a lot of HP, allows you to deal with that. In high reloads, though, he definitely does struggle. Like, I don't think his scaling is insane, mainly because he's so short range. And if people are, like, playing their range, making sure the brand ult doesn't bounce around and stuff, it can be very hard. Also, things like spell shields and Zhonya's can be very, very annoying for Brand to deal with, again, because his ult just gets cancelled completely. So I think, again, in high reloads, I want to say he's probably, like, a B+ or a B. I'm probably just going to put him in B. But again, guys, like, if you're lower elo, Brand is an absolute elo hack, and definitely something that you can think about playing if you just don't know what to play or you're looking for something kind of fun. Cassiopeia is my favorite champion of all time, and I think for the current meta, she is actually pretty well-rounded, so she can be definitely used as a counterpick into short-range compositions, right? Similar to how you'd use Anivia or Talia or something like that. But the thing is that I actually think, weirdly enough, Cassio is a bit more blindable than a champ like Anivia, and that's because of the Qmax Blackfire build that exists. So even on my main, it's still my most played champion, and when I do play into, you know, some of these tougher long-range matchups, I just play this Qmax Blackfire build instead, and it does pretty well. You know, like, you definitely want to try and avoid these matchups still, right? And she is better used as a counterpick, but you can definitely make it work. And as a greedy blind, she kind of pops off because her scaling is really good, and she gives your team comp a lot of what is often lacking, I find, in solo queue. Like, she'll give DPS for objectives, she can help you kill tanks, she provides peel. Like, there's a lot of really useful stuff where, you know, sometimes you just end up in a game of like, oh, you picked Ahri or whatever, and they picked a tank, and your AD carry picked Jhin or Ezreal. Suddenly you can't kill anything, and, you know, you can't do objectives or whatever. So I like Cassio a lot for that reason, but better used as a counterpick, definitely a risky blind. And if you are going to one-trick her, I would really recommend learning both builds. You need to be able to play the Qmax build as well as the regular Emax Conqueror build. Corki, I think, has suffered a bit of a fall from grace, so there's a couple of reasons for that. I think in the current mid-meta, it's really hard for Corki to snowball, and despite being a crit AD carry, Corki's scaling is pretty mediocre because he's so short range. And it's just, like, really hard to actually accelerate mid. I think that Corki bot is super solid still. Like, you can, you know, especially with a support in the 2v2, you can definitely accelerate the game, but in mid, it just feels so difficult, and, like, you are weaker in skirmishes. It's pretty difficult to lane against the mages. It can still be an option if you're really struggling for an AD mid pick, but overall, I think there are much better AD mid picks, and so I would only really be picking Corki because he's relatively straightforward to play mechanically. Even then, though, like, his game plan is not particularly easy. You do have to make sure you're snowballing, like, you do have to be ahead, whether that's in, like, gold or kills or whatever, right? Like, you do have to be taking over the game. It's not enough just to AFK scale, and I think he does kind of suffer at the Atacon and stuff, so not a huge Corki fan at the moment. When I did my melee only challenge earlier in the year, Diana was my most played, and I think this champion is really good for solo queue. When I was in Korea, I became pretty convinced that this champion is, like, sleeper OP, and there's a lot of different builds you can play on this champion, so I think the best one are phase rush builds. I did actually make a Diana guide, which you guys can go and look at, but the phase rush builds feel very hard to deal with. It's very difficult to actually punish Diana in trades, because she can poke and farm from range, and then the trade itself, she can go in with her shield and phase rush out before you can really do a lot of damage in return. She also scales pretty well, just because she farms so fast. Like, she's kind of like Ryze in that her main strength is acceleration. Like, if you leave her alone on the turret, you know, she can take it super fast, she can take plates super fast, she kills jungle camps, like, basically instantly, so you can always end up a lot of gold ahead, and she has pretty decent itemization options as well. Like, if you are solo AP, you can, of course, go for flat pin builds. If you're not, you can definitely play something like Rocket Belt, or you can play Lichbane, or you can even play Mask builds still. Like, there's a lot of things you can do in this champ, and that makes her particularly suited as a one-trick. So if you guys are looking to pick up some sort of melee champion, or you're kind of struggling into either assassins that you can build tank into, or maybe you just don't have a pick into a mobile mages, Diana can fill all those holes in your champion pool for you. So one of the champs I'd recommend the most to you guys at the moment, because she really just isn't that hard, and I think this champion is super slept on. Ekko, I'm not totally sure where I want to put him. I think I'll put him in B+. So the thing with Ekko is that his itemization's pretty good. Like, you're definitely not flat pen reliant. Things like Lich Bane are pretty strong, and the champ itself scales well. I think the big downside of Ekko is that split pushing is definitely less of a win condition than it used to be. It's not terrible, but, you know, like, to have a really effective split push win condition, you need to be able to win early fights and then get the grubs and stuff, and I definitely don't think that's guaranteed as Ekko, because your early lane is not amazing. Into certain things it can be good, right? Like Hail of Blades, there are certain champions that just can't deal with like the A-start Hail of Blades onto them. But also like the things with like bone plating and stuff, and a lot of the mids having CC, it's not super easy for Ekko to trade onto them. So the champ is definitely not bad, and I'm almost tempted to put him higher. Like, I think if you are counterpicking into things that can't punish you and like you can snowball against, he is probably one of the most snowbally champions in the game, let alone assassins. But I do think as an Ekko one trick, it's probably not insane at the moment, but I don't know. You could definitely get challenged on the champ, right? Like, the thing is, he's still a very, very good champ, but he is much better in the jungle, in my opinion. Fizz is one of those champions that is basically never bad in solo queue, but I do think he's kind of a coin flip. So the reason I say that is because, like, Fizz obviously is very, very strong in any early game fight or skirmish, has gank set up, and he is good against the mobile mages, but I do think he struggles in the big 5v5s, and so a lot of Fizz's game plan kind of becomes, like, if you can find a pick in that, you know, 1 minute to 30-second period before an objective spawns, then this champ is really, really good, right? Like, if you find a pick at, say, 1930 and that gives you Atacon, you probably just won your team the game. At the same time, though, like, if you don't manage to catch someone out, you just end up being, like, much less impactful in the actual 5v5, and it can be pretty difficult to snowball mid these days. You know, again, there are so many tools, things like Catalyst, you know, obviously TP, bone plating, etc. Like, there's a lot of tools to dealing with Fizz. So you are, I don't want to say you're like team reliant, because, you know, like, Fizz can definitely succeed without ganks, but he is so much better when you have the champs around you that can gank. Like, if you're playing Fizz with, say, Xin Zhao and Leona compared to, like, I don't know, Kayn and Janna or something, you're going to have a very, very different game, and I think it's going to be a hard champ to one trick at the moment. I would much prefer that Fizz is used as a counterpick, and I think as a counterpick he can really succeed, definitely can be higher up on the list. This one might surprise you guys a little, but I'm going to put Galio near the top of A tier. So the thing is that even though Galio does not have super good scaling into the late game, Galio is still a very, very strong champion for the kind of scaling relevancy that we're talking about. Like, from that 18 to maybe like 25, 27 minute period, Galio is still very, very good. It's really only ultra late game that Galio falls off, and Galio has insane synergy with a lot of champions in the meta. Like, Galio is very, very good with the AD jungle meta. He's really, really good with engaged supports. He's really good with all the bruiser tops, and he's quite good against a lot of the AP mages mids. So just for the meta itself, Galio is very strong. You definitely will be outscaled by certain things, right? And you definitely want to be a little careful with how you pick Galio, because, like, if you play Galio and you end up against something like Anivia or some of these other greedy counter picks like Smolder or something, you can definitely feel like your life is pretty miserable. But by and large, I think Galio is a pretty good pick. I just think the best way to use him is either as a counter pick to heavy AP compositions, or, you know, like things that can't punish you or that you can shut down, like AP assassins, or what is probably more common is you pick him alongside a, you know, engaged composition. Like, if you do see something like Jarvan or Camille, Rakan, Rel, Leona, etc., that definitely ups your Galio value to the point where even if you are playing a bad matchup, you can probably find a lot of impact during the relevant stages of the game. I'm going to drop a kind of hot take here and say that I think Hwei is a little overrated. So the thing with Hwei is that his scaling is, like, decent, but not great. His laning phase, again, is decent, but not great. And I feel like his damage is somewhat inconsistent. You know, like, compared to some of the other stronger mages, things like, again, your Ori, Talia, and Syndra, you know, Hwei definitely can do more damage sometimes, but it's not guaranteed, right? Like, his skill shots are quite slow. You sort of need people to be in a corridor. You sometimes do just get those Hwei-gasm moments, right? When, like, you hit an R and an EE and a QE on, like, a bunch of people stacked up, and you do a ton of damage, and it's great, right? And there is an argument that you can hold the chokes at the Atacon and stuff, which makes him pretty valuable, but it really just feels like there's so many opportunities where, or there's so many fights where you can go from the previous fight being super impactful to the next fight just kind of being useless because someone flashes your Hwei ult, or just because, like, late game or, you know, mid game or whatever, people have a lot more movement speed. It's obviously much harder to hit. So he's a good champ, don't get me wrong, but I think because of his damage being somewhat inconsistent, I don't like him as much as some of the champions that feel like they do comparable or even more damage while having that damage come from much more consistent AoE sources that are easier to land or harder to dodge or whatever. Irelia, I'm going to put near the top of B+. Now, Irelia, I think There's a few big downsides. I think the big one is honestly just she's incredibly hard to play. Like I would say Aurelia is the hardest mid in the game, or like top 3 or something. She's very, very difficult to get consistent value out of. And again, when solo queue is so much about consistency and ease of execution and stuff, like that kind of naturally makes me not want to play Aurelia. That being said, the champion is very, very powerful early and scales surprisingly well. The kind of issue with that is that like she's not a great team fighter, especially when her flash is down, and she's much more inclined to go to the side lane. But just because of how much activity there is from, like the Atacon and the third dragon and stuff, there will be times where you're just forced to group, which feels pretty bad. Now, there maybe is an argument that like, okay, if you're really strong early, potentially you can secure dragons and grubs, and then like maybe you can give a dragon later and just focus on split pushing. Like it can work, don't get me wrong, but it's just so much easier to play something that has like that very consistent 5v5, and that way you don't have to worry about like your teammates not giving the objective and just dying anyway. You can just like group up and stuff. So Aurelia, if you're really, really good at it, does pop off, right? Like obviously there are people like Aurelion King that find a lot of success on her, but if you're going to use her, I think she should be more of a counter pick, especially into mages that can't really deal with her. And you need to be very, very careful about the fights you choose. You've got to be like extremely particular about them. And I find that to be quite hard in solo queue because a lot of the time your teammates will just fight anyways. So that's my take on Aurelia. Jayce is one of the mid laners that I get asked about the most. And the thing with Jayce is that he's a really, really good champion, but the meta mid for him just sucks. Like there are so many mages that are really, really aids for Jayce to deal with. So Jayce is really good against things that he can queue onto in mid kind of for free, or things with like slow skill shots to where like you can proc your phase rush and kind of run around them. But you think of things like Syndra and it's just like very, very difficult. Anything that can just like place something on themselves to stop you from doing stuff, like for example, like Victor W or Victor R, or like Anivia Q or whatever, right? Hwei E. There's a lot of things that just stop Jayce from being aggressive. And there is, again, some value to Jayce just because there aren't a whole lot of like viable AD mids anyway. But I really do think you're making life pretty hard for yourself. Like chances are your opponent will have a much, much easier win condition than you do if you're locking in the Jayce. Like the champ is not easy and you do kind of need to find some snowball. I also think poke is just generally like a little harder to pull off in solo queue compared to just straight up 5v5. That's not to say like Jayce is actually useless in the 5v5, but like a lot of his strength comes from poking before the fight starts, right? So good champion, kind of bad meta. If you want to use him as a counter pick, I think he gets a lot of value, but be very, very careful playing into all these current meta mages. Another champion that I have hugely mixed feelings on is Kassadin. So part of me thinks that Kassadin sucks, and part of me thinks this champ is broken. So I'll tell you why. Basically, the reason I don't think Kassadin's that good is because I don't think Kassadin even scales that well. Like there's a lot of champions that have both stronger early games than Kassadin and also outscale him, right? Because in the straight up 5v5, Kassadin can be CC'd and locked down. Like I said, split pushing isn't as much of a thing these days. And so it can be really, really difficult. Like if you play Kassadin into something like Syndra, you're expecting to fall pretty far behind early. And it's like, yeah, you will be able to beat Syndra in a 1v1 later for sure. But just in straight team fight impact, you're really, really going to struggle in comparison. That being said, the reason I think Kassadin can be good right now is because he kind of does fit the bill as like one of those greedy blinds. Like if something I see a lot is like Kassadin players will blind Kassadin, right? And their opponent being like, oh, I don't want to play, X champion in a Kassadin, so I'm going to go for something that I'm like uncomfortable on, or I'm going to go for something that like really shits on him early. And then I think Kassadin kind of pops off because like it is kind of easy to neutralize at the moment. The early game isn't as important, and Kassadin will outscale a lot of these early game counter picks. But I think definitely in higher elo, where people just kind of pick the meta champs into it anyway, it loses a lot of value. And I do think counterpick Kassadin is not even that good anyway. Like counterpicking and then still losing prior, and potentially you're scaling, you're not getting outscaled, but not having like a massive scaling win condition anyway feels pretty bad. So I don't know. Yeah, you can make it work, but I'm not really a fan of the playstyle in the current game. I find Katarina to be an absolute pest in solo queue. So this champion is definitely not amazing in lane, but I think she is better than she used to be. And she is incredibly good at early game skirmishes while also scaling very, very well. Like you'd be surprised how well Kat scales. I think Katarina, though, she is one of those champions that kind of scales with skill. Like it's kind of similar to LeBlanc, where bad LeBlancs just can't play late game at all, and it's similar to Katarina. But if you're a good Katarina, you can definitely pop off, even in the late game team fights, and all it takes is a couple random kills to really get fed. So I don't think it's super consistent, and I think that, like, yeah, unless you're a cat one trick, you're probably not going to find a ton of success on it. But if you are a cat one trick, it's extremely annoying to play against. You can definitely carry solo queue games if you do, have the mechanics and game sense to pull it off, right? Like you need to be able to choose your roams correctly and find flanks and team fights and stuff. And the champ itself is hard, but she really does pop off. And I think Katarina is a champ that honestly is a little underrated even in pro play. You know, it sounds weird to say that because Cat's kind of known as that champ that needs to get random kills. But I think if Cat isn't punished, she does pop off. And there are some like risky blinds and stuff, things like Talia, where Katarina realistically could free farm. I guess the reason you don't see her is because oftentimes you would see Talia with something like Vi, and that sounds miserable for Cat. But every now and then, I swear there's a Cat angle, and I'm just waiting for someone to prove me right. Moving on to Kayle. Now, you guys have probably seen Desperate Nasus have a huge amount of success with Kayle in Korea, and I think in a lot of ways Kayle feels like the better Kassadin. Like, it feels like you do kind of sack that early game, but your scaling is very good and you synergize pretty well with a lot of the AD carries as well as like the AD bruisers and stuff. The thing is, I find Kayle a pretty tough one to rate because Desperate Nasus really is the only guy that plays it, at least to a very high level. And the thing is, it's like, okay, does this champion suck? And Desperate Nasus is just the only guy who can play it well. You know, like he's the only one making this trash champion work. Or is the champion actually really good and like Desperate Nasus is the only guy who currently knows how to play it and just no one else has put in the effort? Kind of hard to say because Kayle mid was popular in the past, right? Like if you guys remember, people like Nemesis played a lot of Kayle. So I kind of feel like she's probably like a high B+, potentially an A, but I think this is a very difficult one to rate because it's really not a champion you see often, and like I've personally only played against Desperate Nasus I think twice, so I just don't have like a whole lot of, you know, info on the champ, but clearly it's viable, right? And like if you can succeed with a scaling champ like Kayle in Korea, I think you could definitely succeed with it on your guys' servers as well. So a champion worth keeping an eye on, and you know, really realistically I think could be an A tier, but I'm just gonna put it in B+, mainly because I don't really have a good gauge on it. LeBlanc in her good games is really, really good, but I think she's not super pickable at the moment, so there's a couple reasons for that. First off, LeBlanc is pretty reliant on fairly bad items. Like, LeBlanc's best item is definitely Luden's, but Luden's overall is kind of undertuned. Things like Blackfire LeBlanc can be used for the haste, but it doesn't feel that good. And then it's kind of the same thing with her other items. You would like to build Pen, like Shadow Flame and Storm Surge and stuff like that, but Flat Magic Pen is so easily countered. That being said, if you're solo AP, it can definitely go crazy. You can go stuff like second item Horizon, but then it just feels like you'd kind of rather be a different champion. Like, it's not bad, but, and if you're LeBlanc one trick, you'll probably have to play it sometimes. I don't know, like going things like Horizon or Crippling second kind of feels like it just slows you down too much. And I think that LeBlanc can definitely struggle at just the straight up grouped 5v5s unless you can manage to be ahead early or have some like flanks and stuff. So I think, again, LeBlanc in her very good spots, which is like when you have a ganking jungler, a ganking support, and ideally a winning lane, plus your solo AP, I could see LeBlanc being S tier, right? But like that's a lot of conditions to me, and I think in more realistic conditions where maybe one of those is true and the rest aren't, or a couple of them are, or whatever, she's probably a B+ or maybe a low A. And she's also a very difficult champion to play. Like a lot of the time, the opponent will have a much easier time of playing the game than you will. And again, ease of execution, I believe, is such an important thing for solo queue that I think you are making the game like a little hard for yourself with LeBlanc, but you can definitely succeed with her, right? Like the champion itself is strong. She's just more meta-gapped than anything. Lissandra, I find to be a very weird champion at the moment. So Lissandra you'd think would be really good right now. Her skirmishing is good, her team fighting, her 5v5 is excellent, but there's a few major downsides. The first one is she's pretty bad against almost every meta mid. Like, she's pretty tough against mages, and while you can play to gank them, the 1v1 is normally pretty miserable. The things that you would counterpick as Lissandra typically are not blinded, right? Like, you could play listen to something like Fizz, but it's like, okay, how often is Fizz getting blinded? Admittedly, it does happen, right? Like, there are some Lissandra angles, but then you might prefer to play something like a Galio or, you know, like a Diana or a Anivia or something, right? Like, there's a lot of other contesting counterpicks, and I think one of the big downsides of Lissandra is her itemization really sucks, in my opinion. So probably the best build, at least I believe, is to go Blackfire instead of Malignance, and that's mainly so that you can very consistently one-shot the backline with your Q. You can play Malignance, and it's definitely not bad, but it can lead to farming issues, and of course, like, we have the flat pen problem once again. Then the second item, yeah, if you can build flat pen, it's not bad, but stuff like Cosmic is not very good. I don't think Horizon's amazing. You know, like, Zhonya is good on Lissandra, but like in my opinion, Zhonya itself is a pretty weak item, so it just feels like she doesn't have amazing items to build. And when there are other champions that just like love current itemization, right, like champs that can currently use Blackfire Horizon, for example, or Blackfire Crippler or whatever, feel really, really good, and Lissandra just doesn't fall into that category. So it's another champion that is really, really good, has good spots for sure, but is a bit more of a niche pick, and unless her itemization gets buffed, I think she'll struggle to really like take the spotlight. Lux, I feel like, has been criminally underrated underrated for a long time. I think this champion's really, really good. It does a ton of damage, and it has options in haste builds, right? Like, you can very easily build Blackfire and Horizon, which feels great, but you can just as easily play Luden Shadowflame in games where you're solo AP or you don't think they're going to build any Meta Exist. One thing that I think is really, really good about Lux as well is she's probably the best, or like very close to it, the best Darkseal and Magi user in the game. And Darkseal is the single best AP item in the game, so like that enables Lux's playstyle really, really well, and you know, getting use out of that is insane. And if you can go Magi's again, like the item is ridiculous if you can protect it, but it's quite hard on most champions because if you're in a mobile mage, typically, you know, you will get caught, but Lux has self-peel and more importantly, a crazy amount of range, which is super nice. I think if you guys are below, I want to say Master, this champion is really, really good because she's very simple to play. Her skill shots are huge, which is super nice. And even if you have a bad matchup, it's very easy to neutralize. You can hold your Q and W defensively, which makes it hard to punish. Once you get level 6, you can ult every other wave, which is super nice. She does suffer in the side lane, which is a downside, and something I've said in this video is that split pushing is not a super good win condition, but split pushing and side laning are different. Normally when I say split pushing, I mean like taking turrets and inhibs and stuff, but side laning, like getting prior over the side, is pretty important, and Lux is quite bad at that. You can really just only ult waves, so that's her biggest weakness, is kind of that mid-game period where you're probably just going to be forced to ult or catch waves on the side rather than getting a lot done. But I really do think the champion is broken. So like if you're, again, I want to say below Diamond, or sorry, below Master probably, I think this champion is ridiculously good and something you can have as part of your pool. You guys probably know that I've done hundreds of coaching sessions by now, and I think Malzahar is one of the most polarizing champions in the game. So Malzahar in high elo is pretty weak, and the reason is that Malzahar's early laning is just complete trash. Like the first, say, like 6 levels of Malzahar's lane, particularly pre-chapter, are just awful. It's really easy to punish him for using cooldowns on wave. It's really easy to like force trades on him even with all cooldowns up and just win. And what happens is it becomes just so difficult for Malz to get that first, you know, that really good first chapter base. More likely he's getting it on his second base or something, and by then you're so far behind against other scaling champions like Syndra or Ori that it just doesn't feel that good. That being said, if you can't punish Malzahar, and I think Malzahar is like a perfect litmus test for how good your laning phase is, if you cannot punish Malzahar on the first base, this champion is fucking broken. Like, he does absurd amounts of damage, and the only real counterplay window is in that first 6 minutes. And the thing is, like, that window in high-low is so big, or like so punishing, I guess, that like he just can't be played almost. But in lower elos, like, you're going to get away with this a lot of the time, and the scaling is absolutely ridiculous. So I want to say if you're probably plat below, it's like an easy S. I think as you go up from there, he probably like gradually falls down in tier to where in higher elos he really just isn't that good. But like seriously, this is one of the most elo hack champions you can play. Super high damage basically no matter what. You can have like crazy amounts of impact on the game. Really the only thing you need to get good at is neutralizing your first base, knowing, you know, like keeping the wave on your side and maybe not using too many cooldowns on the wave and stuff. But it's slept on for sure. And I even think in high elo there's probably some windows to use Malzahar. It just kind of comes back to like, okay, if they've greeted something, you know, if they've greeted a blind that doesn't particularly pressure lane, you could go Malzahar for the free scaling, but there's a lot of other free scalers that are really good too, right? Things like Azir or maybe Sol, Anivia, right? There's a lot of competing picks for that slot. But like I said, in low elo, absolutely broken. Now, this one's going to be interesting. Potentially my hottest take of the tier list. I think Mel kind of sucks. So I get asked about this champion all the time, and there's a lot of people that think she's just like giga broken, but I'll give you guys my thoughts on it. So first thing is, I think Mel's damage, most of all, is very, very inconsistent. Her Q is very slow. Like you'll hit 1 or 2 of the missiles and you'll proc the Comet, but Comet is quite dodgeable, and like if you dodge most of the missiles, you know, it's not going to deal a ton of damage. Her E is also quite slow as well. Like, you are reliant on other, you know, CC or slow setup or whatever in order to hit that, which feels pretty bad because you would think that a champion with inconsistent skill shots would deal ridiculous damage if you hit them, right? Like, if you look at some of the other champions that are a bit more inconsistent, like something like Syndra actually is a really good example. Syndra's abilities, I would say, are easier to hit and have more impact and deal more damage. And so for that reason, like, I don't really like Mel in the early to mid game. And then like late game, something that Mel struggles with is movement speed. So there's comps that just have like a lot of MS, and that can make your life even more difficult. That's something that a lot of mages struggle with, by the way, but it's particularly bad for Mel. So overall, I just feel like the champion the damage is inconsistent. Even when you hit it, it doesn't do that much. I don't think the scaling is that good. And the mid lane matchups are not particularly good either. There's a lot of long range mages that are very good into Mel. So your typical ones, things like Syndra or Victor, but also some of the niche counterpicks, things like Xerath or Vel'Koz can really pop off into Mel. So that makes me feel like Mel's best place is actually in the bot lane. You know, like I think playing AP carry Mel is probably the best role. The thing is that playing AP carry, it's kind of annoying, right? Like the best team composition is to play 1 AP, 4 AD in my opinion. And so it can make picking mid quite difficult because ideally you play an AD mid if you have Mel. But at the same time, it's like the AD mids are not particularly blindable. So yeah, basically for all those reasons, I'm not too high on the Mel. I'm kind of willing to concede that she probably should be a little higher than where I have her here, but basically I just feel like if you're going to play something with inconsistent damage and a somewhat weaker laning phase, there's better options that have like way more consistent 5v5 and scale a lot better. A champion at almost the other end of the spectrum when it comes to consistency is Morgana. So I think Morgana in a lot of ways is kind of a modern day Malzahar. So she kind of has that thing where she needs to be punished early, and admittedly some of the range mages at the moment can punish her in lane, but she is more difficult to punish. She has better tools at trading back, like Q is a really good defensive tool to stop someone from just walking past the wave and trading with you, and she also has sustain, which is very nice, and obviously her wave clear is very powerful very early, and she has that gank setup available earlier as well. So there's a lot of ways to kind of neutralize that pre-6 in ways that Malzahar can't. I don't think her scaling is quite as good as Malzahar's, but honestly it's pretty good. So I would really suggest if you guys are looking for, you know, another kind of like easy mid laner to play, Morgana should definitely be up there. It's a champ that I might consider like making a guide on or something at some point because there isn't a whole lot of content about her. Probably just because there doesn't really need to be, like she's not that hard, but it's a super sleeper champion at the moment and kind of similar to stuff like Brand and Malzahar, particularly if you're lower elo, she's insanely broken. So don't sleep on Morgana, that champ's super sick. Now I'm not totally sure where I want to put Naafiri. I'm kind of tempted to put her at the top of B+, or maybe the bottom of A. I think maybe somewhere around here. So the thing is with Naafiri is like she can basically just build bruiser items, which feels pretty good. Like she is an assassin, but again, like she can use the bruiser items, which feel really good. The thing is though, like Naafiri's laning phase early is pretty weak. You can definitely suffer now with D-Shield second wind nerfs, and also from the fact that like you have to use mana to farm. So if you're going something like longsword refill, you know, you don't have a way to sustain, but like you're using Q to farm, which costs mana, and then you can't trade, which feels really, really bad. So I don't know, it's a good pick if you can get away with it, but it's definitely greedy, and it is a hell of a lot better in the jungle. I kind of think I want to put her at the top of B+, just because I feel like she's not quite as good as the champs up here. But, I don't know, she is a good champ. Like, if you could just spawn in after laning phases Naafiri, I think the champ would be super sick. But you're really going to suffer against, like, the phase rush or self-peel or dash mid laners mid before that. You're going to have, like, a difficult time getting on them, and you're going to take a lot of poke and potentially drop some CS in return. While Naafiri's scaling is good, she needs to be able to farm and stuff to do that, and if you are getting pressured early, that's a lot harder. So it's a decent champ, but maybe not quite in the upper echelon. Neeko is a champ that suffered a lot from Riot lately. She's been nerfed a few times in mid, and her laning phase has become a lot weaker, and as a result, I feel like her laning phase kind of doesn't make up for her poor scaling. That being said, in the support role, Neeko is absolutely busted. Like, if you want to play Neeko right now, definitely play support. It's like an S or probably A+ tier support. It's really, really, really good. But in mid lane, you're a bit more limited. Like, your laning phase isn't as oppressive as before. There's definitely less things you can do with the minions because it's harder to just like go down another lane, like in the mid game or even in like the early game or whatever. So there's like less playmaking opportunities, and you kind of do need to make those plays to offset your poor scaling. You still can carry the game, like for sure around like 20 minutes or whatever. Like, you are still very strong at the Atacon fight, and if you get a big ult, like you will have a lot of impact. I don't know, maybe she shouldn't be solo, it's hard to say. It just feels like she's so much better in support that it's like, why play her mid? But honestly, she's still a decent mid laner. You can definitely succeed with her. Orianna is another insanely good solo queue champion at the moment, and I'm not sure if I want to put her in S tier or A+. I think for most of you watching, she's probably going to be A+. So there's a few reasons behind this. So the thing is, like, in high-low, Ori's really, really good. Like, Ori is a strong laner, she scales well, she's good skirmisher, great phase rush user, she picked like all the time. She's just super well-rounded champion. But there's a couple things, I guess, that keep her out of S tier, especially in lower elos. So Ori gains a lot of extra value by being paired with like AD bruiser junglers or tops, and also hyper carry ADs and potentially engage supports. Now, that's not to say that you need those to play Ori. You definitely don't. But like in high elo, you're going to have those pretty much every game, whereas like in lower elos, you're going to have a lot more weird shit that Ori doesn't synergize particularly well with. So she is a self-sufficient champ anyway, which means you don't require them, but again, it's nice to have that little bit of extra boost. And I do think that the biggest downside of Ori, especially for you guys, is she definitely doesn't provide that much from behind. Like, you still provide some utility, but you're not a champion like Syndra or something that will just kind of like AFK scale into the game, even if you don't snowball the lane. So in a lot of ways, I'd say Ori is just like a very difficult game plan to pull off at the moment. Like, you guys might just find it easier to play something that has a bit more of a, yeah, you know, like a bit more of a scaling curve, something like Morgana, which is like an easier version, basically. But if you play the laning phase well, like if you go up CS and you play the skirmishes well, she's a really good side laner. Like, Ori is broken in high elo for a reason, but it is kind of difficult to pull off. I think, yeah, I want to say if you're Master Plus, she's probably S, but I think below that, I want to say A Plus, and probably falling lower as you go lower ranked. I think if you're, you know, sitting in like gold or whatever, obviously you can still play her. She's a great champ for learning, but there's much, much better champs to play instead. Qiyana is kind of a weird champion because, like, honestly, she's kind of just been role swapped to jungle. Qiyana is a much, much better jungler than she is a mid. You just get to skip the whole, like, bad laning phase and, you know, having to kind of, like, drop waves in order to pick up kills or whatever. Instead, you can just clear your jungle efficiently. You don't have to deal with really any, like, 1v1 interaction. You get to skip the whole weakest part of your game, which is, like, normally the first few levels. It's just insanely, insanely good in jungle. And so, like, obviously, you can still play it mid. I think that as a one-trick or as a counter pick or whatever, like, she finds some value for sure, but there's so many bad mid matchups in the meta. I think her scaling, especially when you don't have access to guaranteed income, which definitely happens as a melee assassin in mid, can fall off quite a bit. So realistically, I think she should just be played jungle. Like, if you want to be a counter player, it's so much easier in jungle. Ryze, I think, is one of the most misunderstood champions in the entire game. So I'm going to kind of talk about Ryze just in general. The thing with Ryze is way more of an early game champ than a scaling champ. And the main reason for that is because he's really good at pushing and moving. He's got great gank setup. He's got great roaming. You can impact the map really early. You can snowball super hard. But his teamfight scaling is pretty poor because despite him doing a shit ton of damage, he's very short range and he has to root himself to cast. So in those later 5v5s, what often happens is you just get CC'd and die, which feels really, really bad, obviously. Now, that means later on in the game, the way to play as Ryze is to focus on acceleration, right? It's to focus on shoving in the sideways and creating 5v4s and taking jungle camps, pressuring turrets and stuff. But what often happens is, like, if you make a slight mistake, you know, like you die on the side lane or you get pushed out, you've got to reset up your vision, and you're just a lot weaker in the straight up 5v5. So, like, every now and then, I still play Ryze, right? Like, I played a really good Ryze game yesterday, which felt amazing, but I think it's a very situational pick. It's definitely not something that I go for very often. It's ideal into shorter range compositions, especially ones without CC, or in games where, like, you have a lot of assistance mid. Like, if you can play with a ganking jungler and a ganking support, makes it a lot better. And I really do think if you're playing Ryze just to AFK scale, you're probably doing the wrong thing. You really should see this as a champion that, like, needs to accelerate. And again, that doesn't have to be from kills. Like, a lot of the time it'll just be from, like, prio and deep wards and CS lead and all that. But if you're even on Ryze, I would say you're losing, and it's not a particularly easy champion to play in the current meta, especially if you're in an elo where you can't really rely on jungle support to play with and around mid for you. If you guys have watched the channel for a while, you may know that I was a Smolder mid enthusiast, and for a while I kind of went off him. Like, I think the meta, especially in Split 1 of this year, was pretty fast-paced, and there were a lot of skirmishes early, so it was quite difficult to make Smolder work, so I had him drop in tier a lot. Now, though, I would say Smolder is back to being pretty good. I've played a lot of Smolder recently. Admittedly, I did lose my last couple games, but I have been having insane success on Smolder, and I've actually been playing Conqueror instead of Fleet. You can also play PTA, but I think Fleet is kind of a bait. And yeah, I actually think the champion is really, really good in solo queue. It's probably a little bit better in bot lane overall, but it's still a pretty good champ mid, either as a counter pick to things that don't really pressure the lane. Like, you really want to avoid things like Victor or Syndra or Ori. So admittedly, a lot of the meta mids, which, you know, can be a downside, it is a little bit difficult to pick. But anything that doesn't super hard pressure in the lane, you just scale ridiculously well. And if you go, I'll just like quickly show my runes. Like this is what I've been playing. What I would recommend is swapping this to Cashback if you're in a skill shot matchup. So if you are playing against one of those, just go Cashback instead. Cashback's pretty good right now as well. And Conqueror is surprisingly good. It's hard to fully stack, but you still get value even if it's not stacked, right? Like you're still getting AD, and you will stack it in later team fights. And if you do have like a long skirmish or whatever in the early game, it's going to get a lot of value. So I really do think the champ is quite good. For sure, a greedy pick. Not something that you want to pick every game by any means, but it goes absolutely crazy. The thing is, it's definitely not an easy champ to play, right? Like, mechanically, Smolder's pretty simple, but his game plan is very difficult. It's kind of like Ryze in some ways. Like, not so much the pushing and moving, but it's an acceleration champ. You need to be ahead CS, you need to be ahead stacks. It's really important not to die. You've got to, like, kind of get pressure over your lane, mostly through push, rather than, like, direct 1v1 interaction. So it's pretty hard champ to pull off. But like I said, if you play it well, I think this champion is really, really good at the moment. So, yeah, if you want to check out some of my Smolder gameplay, you can check out the VODs on my YouTube or my Twitch. Or, of course, like, if you have any questions, just send me a message. So for Swain, I think Swain is super, super good. I think he should be somewhere in A tier. So the thing is with Swain is there's a lot of overlap with Swain and other champions. Like Swain is really, really good as a greedy pick into shorter range or tankier compositions. The thing is though, there exist so many good champs mid into this, right? Like you imagine they, I don't know, blind pick something like Galio. It's like, well, you've got like Cassiopeia, you've got Anivia, you've got Swain, Talia, Smolder. Like there's so many. But the nice thing about Swain is that Swain is a lot easier than these other champions. So if you're looking for something to play into like assassin comps where you need to be tankier, or into short range comps where, you know, like you're kind of scared of dying as like in a mobile mage, and you know the fights are going to be very long, Swain definitely pops off. Like I think this champion is very, very good, and it's a champ that is not too difficult to add to your champ pool, but also adds like a lot of returns, right? Because there are some champs that you can spend a lot of time learning, but you still only get to pick them very rarely, whereas a champ like Swain is both like not that hard to play, and I think you'll get a lot of value out of him. He's one of the easier counter picks to play and just goes absolutely nuts. So if you are struggling with melees, if you're struggling with assassins, you're struggling with engage comps, Swain is the absolute answer to this. He's super, super good, a lot of build flexibility, and extremely underrated in my opinion. On the other side of things, I think Sylas is super overrated. The thing with Sylas is it kind of feels just super coin flip. I don't know, like Sylas's 1v1 lane doesn't feel that strong. He is obviously like very, very good in skirmishes, but nowadays you mostly see Sylas going in the jungle for the same reason as champs like Qiyana do, just because it is way, way, way more consistent and you get to avoid those early lanes. I still think you definitely can play Sylas, but it's going to want to be as a counter to either you see a lot of really good ults, and that way, even if your matchup is bad, you can still pop off, or you're into some sort of matchup that you know you can beat and snowball 1v1, or I guess like if they're a mobile and you have a lot of gank set up on your team, you can do that. You basically just need a way to snowball, whether that's 1v1 or 2v2, 3v3, whatever, or you need to have really, really good ults to prop up your scaling. You know, things like Malphite or Alistar, stuff like that obviously go really hard. So definitely more of a niche pick at the moment, and I think it is much, much better in the jungle. Next, we have Syndra, and I think Syndra is probably the single best champion that you guys can learn or invest time into at the moment. And there's a few reasons for that. So reason number one is this champion is insanely good at basically every stage of the game. Her scaling is really, really good. Admittedly, it's not quite as good as say like Azir or Asol or Smolder, but it's like almost there, right? Like late game, you do so much damage, your stuns are so low cooldown, and you can just stun the entire team over and over. She's super difficult to play against late game, but in spite of that, and unlike a lot of these champions, she pressures the laning phase really hard, and she's really good gank setup and skirmishing, right? Like if you compare it to a champ like Victor, it's like, yeah, you get outlaned a tiny bit, and yeah, you get outscaled a little bit, but what you gain is you gain, like I said, really good gank setup, and your skirmishing and snowball potential is really, really good. So insanely well-rounded, and on top of that, I actually don't think the champion is that hard these days. She is kind of skill shot reliant, which is where most of the difficulty comes from, but the skill floor is not too high, because there are ways to make your skill shots more guaranteed. For example, slowing with W, or going for WQ stuns, RE stuns. Like, there's a lot of things you can do to kind of take off a little bit of the skill, and in spite of that, she's really, really good. Like, it kind of, I think it says something that I see a lot of Syndras in high-elo who are not particularly good at the champ, and they still find a lot of success with her. So I've got a really good Syndra guide on my YouTube, and if you only watch like one section of it, just watch the combos section, because it'll go a really long way. But yeah, this champion is absurdly broken. I think that There is an argument that maybe in Challenger she falls off a little bit, and the reason for that is because she is skill shot reliant, and against better players, it's harder to hit that, of course, and she can suffer a little bit from immobility, but like Phase Rush can make up for that, and of course, like she scales anyway, right? So even if you die and stuff, chances are you'll find a lot of impact at the Atacon or whatever anyway. So insanely broken and is just for sure S tier. Talia is another premier control mage at the moment. I'm not quite sure where I'd put her. I want to say maybe here. So the thing with Talia is Talia's scaling is absurdly good, but she does suffer a little bit more in the 1v1 laning phase. Like, it can definitely be hard to play against champs like this, and it's a pretty difficult champ to lane on. Like, if you're a really good laner on Talia, you can neutralize these for sure, and if you have the right setup around you, you know, things like Rel, Leona, Jarvan, Vi, etc., it can make it a lot more playable, but the 1v1 can definitely be hard, and it is a kind of greedy blind, so I think the best way to use Talia is just as a counter pick. I think the thing that holds Talia back, actually, is a lot of people seem to itemize kind of badly on her. So the classic on Talia is to go like Seraph Liandry. And don't get me wrong, like that's a good standard. But there's a lot of games where that's not going to be particularly good. There's definitely games where you want to go say like Seraph Horizon Deathcap, or you want to play like Seraph Cripploom Deathcap or something like that. And I often do see, you know, people go to Liandry and then like something like Cripploom third, and it's just like, well, you've got like no AP and you just like don't really do any damage, and also the build takes a long time to come online. Obviously, Liandry HP is kind of useful, but there's a lot of games you don't need it. In fact, there's some games you can even drop Seraph. So I think this champ's really good, but I do think you need to be careful. I wouldn't just go Liandry every game, especially now that it has, well, only 60 AP, I think, and obviously it has no haste. Like, it's missing a lot of stats that Talia could like. Of course, situationally good, but just be careful with it. Still, though, it's insanely good. Like, you can neutralize any matchup. You're a pretty good skirmisher as long as you have setup, and the scaling is super good. You're really, really good in the short range comps. Absolutely amazing counter pick. Talon is another victim of Riot starting to balance him for jungle. So Talon jungle is really, really, really good, but the problem with mid is basically the same thing as before. The laning phase can be pretty tough. Most mages and stuff will bully you out, so you're really reliant on your opponent making a mistake so you can kill them, or like random skirmishes to happen, or maybe roaming to other lanes and picking up kills. It's definitely still playable in solo queue, you know, like just as a champ that can run around and get a lot of kills. He's naturally going to be good for smurfing, but I think it can be pretty difficult, especially as you get to higher elos, to really pull off. And I would encourage you, if you are a Talon player, to just head towards the jungle instead, as that is just like a much more forgiving role for him. You get to freely scale to level 3, you know, you don't have to play those really tough early levels, and then you can just like pop off from there with much more guaranteed income from all the jungle camps. Trist mid has been kind of on and off lately. I think the champion is really, really good as a counter pick. It's kind of like a more aggressive counter pick compared to something like Smolder. So the thing with Trist is she suffers a lot into these mages that you can't easily jump on. So anything that has CC to stop you from Wing forward, or anything that pokes heavily from long range, makes Trist's life really difficult. Ever since they nerfed like Absorb Life, Fleet, both the healing and the movement speed, it's made her life very, very difficult. So you kind of do need to pick her into a matchup where you can either freely jump forward, or you can like farm for free for whatever reason, and you know, just like end up scaling as a crit 80 carry. I think if you can get a good Trist game, the champ is incredibly good. But I'm putting her in B tier because I think that situation is very, very rare. Like, probably what you're looking for is like a blind pick Galio or something. And even then, it's like you'd probably prefer to take Smolder. Like, I just think you are less reliant on needing to snowball the game. But if you want stronger early skirmishing power and maybe more kill threat, that's definitely the way to get it. So it's a champ you can pick, but it's definitely pretty rare. Now, personally, I don't put a lot of value on TF, but I definitely don't think the champ is bad. So it's kind of a couple things with this. Like I said at the very start of the video, the game is mostly, it comes down to like these big 5v5s, and TF is not that good in a straight 5v5. He is quite good at pressuring the side and creating a numbers advantage, but that can definitely be difficult into a lot of like the 1v1 losing matchups, and it definitely feels way more consistent to just be an AoE team fighter compared to something like TF. And if you want to play for kind of like the mid jungle 2v2, like pushing and moving and stuff like that, it does feel like champs like Ahri and Aurora do that almost as well, but offer much more team fighting power. So I guess like I think TF is a pretty good champion, but overall it's just way more trouble than it's worth. I think it's just so much easier to play a champion that scales better, plays the 5v5, but you can definitely pull it off. And if you're really, really good at side laning, like if you know how to pressure and like bring people away, you can use that to turn the team fights into your favor. And funnily enough, TF, very similar to a champ like Ryze, is a lot about acceleration. Like you can get so much gold from farming on TF because of the way his passive works, and you can use that plus your ulti to end up being really ahead of both XP and gold compared to other people in the game. And again, very similar to Ryze, that can allow you to take fights that you wouldn't normally be able to take because you're just overstated. So there definitely is something to TF. I definitely don't think he's an awful champ by any means, but I think you guys would find a lot more success on something with a much easier to execute win condition. Veigar is kind of an interesting champion. I've played a little bit of Veigar lately. I was inspired because Bulldog on Korea, I think he's like 2.2 KLP last split as a mid, actually did play a few games of Veigar with a pretty good win rate. So the champion is definitely not bad. My take on Veigar is it's kind of just like not worth what you give up for it. So Veigar, you can go something like Seraph Deathcap, which feels really good. Like you've got a lot of damage, you've got a lot of control, which is nice, but your early game is very, very weak. Like you don't really offer much, whether that's in lane or in skirmishes or whatever. And the scaling, you know, again, scaling damage-wise is pretty good, but the short range makes life really, really tough. So I don't really like him for that reason. I also think the itemization can be a little tough because it's difficult as such a weak laner to go Seraphs and a Deathcap. It kind of feels like you have to play something like Roa instead, or maybe you can even rush Cosmic with a tier or something. But all those delay your Deathcap, and it feels like Deathcap is where Veigar really comes online because you make use of all the extra AP you have. So again, I think it's like clearly like a pretty good champ, right? Like it can be played, as seen by Bulldog, like having success with it at the top of Korean Challenger. But I think again, it's just such a rare pick that it's probably not super worth investing into. And I think most times you'd pick Veigar, you'd probably have more success playing something else instead. So something you could think about in a shorter range comps or into perhaps matchups where you can't really be punished. But I definitely don't think you want to one-trick the champ, and I think I would be... yeah, I'd be very, very careful playing him instead of something that's perhaps like a bit easier and a bit more consistent like Swain. Another underrated mid laner I would say is Vel'Koz. So I'm not going to put him crazy high because he's definitely a niche counter pick and he's not easy to play. But I think Vel'Koz can be pretty good into other mages. You know, like Vel'Koz is really good into things like Mel. I mean, he's actually pretty good against things like Ori. He's good against Hwei. The main reason I think you don't see Vel'Koz more is that most of those champions have other answers as well, and it's like, are you really going to put in all the effort it takes to learn Vel'Koz just to play those few matchups? Probably not, because it is a really difficult champ, right? Like, you're going to need to put in a ton of time investment into Vel'Koz, and he's just not super pickable. So, like, yeah, if somehow Vel'Koz is already part of your pool, or if you think you're really good at him, it definitely is a good counter pick. Like, it kind of pops off, but it's just... again, kind of another one of those examples where, or another one of those champs, it's just not really worth the time investment, I don't think, for the amount of games you have to sink in for how rarely you're actually going to pick him in a good situation. Vex has started to see a little more play in high-low with a haste-focused build, which is where you go Blackfire Cosmic or even Blackfire Horizon. I think this build is not bad. Like, I definitely think it punishes short-range compositions, and it is quite good, like, if the enemy team has a lot of dashes or something like that. Realistically, though, Vex is a champion that you would see in competitive as you get, like, later in the series, as, like, more champions get banned out by Fearless, and that's just because, like, there are better options in this, right? Like, if you are against some shorter-range composition, you've got things like Talia, you've got Cassiopeia, Anivia, Swain. Like, there's a lot of options you would go towards before you pick Vex. That being said, if you're lower elo, Vex is like a really good champion to play. She's pretty fun, and she's not super hard to pick up, and I think with the Blackfire Cosmic build, she's actually quite easy to play. You don't have to focus so much on finding the perfect engage, and instead you can focus on just putting out as much CC as possible, looking to play a regular front to back. You can kind of use your ult for a cleanup instead of engage, and it's really, really valuable. So it's a champion, like I said, if you're below, let's say, Diamond, I kind of recommend. I think it should be pretty high up on the list, but as you get to higher elos, there are just better options available, and her laning phase into mages can suffer quite a bit. Victor, for me, is probably a high B or a low A. I'm kind of tempted to put it as a low A. So the thing with Victor is that he's like a very... He's got very specific skills that are like super maxed out. Like, he's incredibly good at laning. Like, Victor's laning phase is absolutely insane. But Victor is very similar to Caitlyn, where he's like an absolute beast in the lane, and then he has this huge mid-game trough. Like, if you didn't snowball the early game, you have this massive mid-game trough before you finally come back in the late game. So a lot of skill of Victor is just being able to crush your laning phase as hard as possible to stop the enemy from starting like random skirmishes or whatever, and making sure if any skirmish does happen, it's a 2v1, because like you're really not going to bring a lot. You're really just there to try and steal some KP in order to get some stacks. You don't want early fights. You really want to be very picky early about, you know, fighting before your first item or whatever. And that's pretty hard to pull off in solo queue. And also, like, that mid-game trough can really hurt you. Like, if you end up falling just a little bit far behind, or even just not getting ahead, you can have a very tough time being forced to fight third dragon early and being forced to fight Atakan at 20 minutes or whatever. So I just think it's so much more consistent to play a champ like Syndra, because you do lose a tiny bit in laning, you lose a tiny bit in scaling, but she makes up for having, like, skirmish ability and having gang set up and stuff like that. Things that Victor lack. I will say something I tried on Victor lately is going for Q evolve first. So this is something I've seen a few people do, is going Q evolve just for greater lane pressure, and it's actually quite good in skirmishes as well. What you're giving up is the E wave clear, which isn't super necessary because using your prio on Victor early isn't that important. You know, like if you push the wave as Victor, it's kind of like then what, right? You don't really want to roam. Maybe you can go for deep wards or something, but ultimately you kind of want the wave in the middle so that you can punish your opponent as hard as possible. So I think Q evolve is underrated, and that might actually let you have a bit more impact early. And I experiment a little bit with actually going W evolve second instead of A, because if you get enough AP, you can actually just kill the wave with your A pretty close anyway. And that felt decent. I will admit I haven't played this a whole lot, so I can't, you know, swear by it or anything, but I think that's not bad. Again, that allows you to fight or like start taking fights quite a bit earlier, and it feels pretty good, especially in the 1v1 as well, like running someone down in the side lane. So Victor definitely has potential, but I do think there are better options available. Mostly Syndra is the big one. But if you really just want to crush mage matchups, Victor is the go-to. Vlad I'm not super sure about. I think the champ is not bad. So the thing with Vlad is, like, you have very good scaling, but you can't fight that often. You need to fight when your sums are up, basically, and that, especially in the early game, can be a problem if there are a lot of early game skirmishes. But, you know, like, Vlad with both sums at, like, a 20-minute Atakan fight is pretty powerful. The thing is, again, it's like, there's a lot of matchups that can be pretty punishing early that might force you into kind of, like, unfavorable setups. You know, like, if you play against something like Syndra, you might, say, have to play TP Ghost instead of Flash Ghost, or you might need to take Resolve instead of, I don't know, Inspiration or Precision or something. So it kind of feels like you lose a lot of, like, what, you know, good scaling Vlad gets, because some of the meta matchups are just too hard to play anyway. And a lot of these matchups that you would counterpick into, you're still going to lose prior, which feels quite bad. Like, if you use a counterpick and you lose prior, that kind of sucks. Like, what you want is to win lane and outscale, and I feel like there's just not that many meta matchups that Vlad can pick into where he both wins lane and scales. Now, you can use him as a greedy blind. Like, if you go for a blind pick Vlad, especially in low reloads, and you don't get punished, you can take over the game for sure. And I think, you know, again, especially in low reloads, there's a lot of champions that just can't really do anything against Vlad, right? Like, if you don't, say, play a Ryze or a Cassiopeia or like an Aurelion or Syndra, you can definitely struggle into Vlad. So it's an underrated champ for sure. I think he's somewhere in B+. I'm not really sure where. I'll probably just put him here because I don't really know exactly where. But yeah, he's a little slept on, but there's also clear reasons that kind of stop him from being in the crazy high tiers. To me, Xerath feels very similar to Mel, where it's got inconsistent skill shots, and it doesn't feel like he does enough damage to justify those skill shots being so hard to hit. So what you'll really feel, especially in high reloads, is that when you play a champ like Xerath, it's just going to be too difficult to hit people that are consistently, like, moving well and dodging well, and also with how many dashes and how much movement speed creep there is in the game, it can be very, very difficult. You can use Xerath as a counterpick to other mages, but again, there's champs like that just don't suffer so much from the inconsistency factor, or if they do a lot more damage for it. So, you know, something with, like, more consistent abilities would be something like Victor, and something with similar inconsistent abilities would be something like Syndra, but Syndra does, like, way more CC and way more damage. So Xerath kind of just feels mediocre. He's definitely not horrible. Like, I remember I played, I think, around 7 games in EU of Xerath at the start of the year, and I think I was like 5-2. But you got to be very specific about when you pick him, and pretty much every time I do pick him, I kind of do just feel like I should pick something like a Syndra or a Victor or something instead. So it's for sure a fun champ. Like, I love playing Xerath, but it would be really nice if he did a bit more damage to justify his abilities being kind of hard to hit. Yasuo is a champion that's pretty much either B tier or maybe A+. So basically what that depends on is a few things. The thing with Yasuo is that he's insanely strong in lane. Like, 1v1, Yasuo's an absolute beast. He's also very, very good on the side lane. Like, there's not that many champs outside of, like, top laners, you know, things like Jax or whatever, that can beat Yasuo in a 1v1. So you're going to have a lot of pressure in the 1v1. You're going to be able to accelerate, have higher CS and stuff like that for sure. The thing is, though, Yasuo is very bad in the 5v5 unless he has specific champs around you. So if if you have something like Yasuo, Diana, Rel, that's going to be absolutely insane at an Atacon or a Dragon fight, right? Like, you're going to find super high value, you're going to be really over-leveled, you're going to have a ton of golden XP or whatever, and you're going to be just giga strong. You're going to be able to carry that fight. But what I more realistically see from Yasuo's is that, like, the enemy mid just neutralizes, goes down maybe 20 CS in the laning phase, and they're just 10 times more useful. You know, like, if you have one of these control mages, or like a Lissandra, or even an assassin at one of these 20-25 minute fights compared to a Yasuo, unless they can find some big ult, they tend to not find a lot of value. So, I don't know, it seems to me like way more trouble than it's worth, but again, like, if you're really good at Yasuo, if you can pick it with the right things, Rels, Dianas, Gragas, etc., or maybe, you can definitely find impact on the game. It just feels, again, like your opponent's going to have so much easier time than you, and I just think ease of execution in solo queue is so broken. I'm going to make a video on this pretty soon, but honestly, guys, like, the easier champs you can play, the better, and Yasuo's both game plan and champion itself is not particularly easy. Yone suffers from similar problems that Yasuo has, but they're a little less bad. So the thing with Yone is that he's one of these greedy counter picks, right? Like, Yone scales really, really well. He's got good side laning and stuff like that. But the issue with Yone is that he's, despite being incredibly strong on Bork, he's a really poor team fighter until 2 items, because he's just too squishy without shield bow. And what often happens is that, you know, Yone kind of falls behind a little bit in the early game. Like, he might be at a 1v, he might have a CS lead or whatever, but, you know, you're not going to be able to contest early dragons, or you're probably not going to be able to contest early grubs as Yone, because you just don't offer enough. And then if you find your team falling behind, like, it can be difficult to really have a big side lane win condition in order to make enough gold to have your shield bow by the time you're contesting third dragon or Atacon or whatever. And that's a big problem, because if you do manage to hit those items in time, then, like, Yone's actually a pretty good team fighter, right? Like, if you can get pushed on the side and you can be the one that's there first and have setup and have a flank or whatever, like, that's really good. But again, I also see, like, a lot of Yones show up and they're still very squishy and they get CC'd once and they just die, which really, really sucks. So it's a champ that I think is underrated, but similar to maybe something like Smolder, it's got a very specific win condition, and you've got to, like, follow this line all the way through the game, and if, like, you fuck it up a little bit, you just become completely useless. So you've got to play really, really well, and, you know, as I keep harping on about in this video, it's so much easier just to play scaling, team fight 5v5. If you're going to play Yone, definitely use him as a counter pick. Use it into comps or champs or whatever that can't pressure you much early, and they're going to allow you free scaling. Ideally, the less CC in the team fight, the better as well. Now, the new champion, Zaahen. So, the thing is, this champion is getting hotfix nerfed. They're hotfix nerfing his damage because at the moment, his damage is absolutely insane. I don't know if you guys have tried this champion, but he can get like 800, 900 AD or something, because the combination of his passive and Conqueror pretty much double his AD when he's fully stacked, which is absolutely insane. So, he just does ridiculous amounts of damage. Now, the thing is, currently this champion is just broken in every role. I don't actually think this champion is going to be that good a mid laner after he kind of, like, reaches a balanced state, because I think he does struggle against, you know, phase rush champs. He struggles against things that can kite him, and that's going to be pretty difficult in mid, especially when his gank setup is not particularly reliable. So I don't know, if you're picking him as you see this tier list, he's pretty good. Like, especially as a counter pick into melees or things that can't really pressure the lane. You just kind of want Zaahen on your team because he's very, very strong. But I do think more realistically, he's going to end up in the B+ tier eventually. You know, he's just going to be another champ like the rest of these, where he's a counter pick into specific things. He's really, really good at those specific things. But the lack of, like, reliable gank setup and the difficulties with getting kited by ranged champs hold him back when compared to something like Ambessa. So I'll probably just put him, I don't know, like somewhere in B tier. I think potentially he'll be strong for a while, so he'll just sit in A tier. But I really, well, yeah, I'll just leave him here. But I think he'll get nerfed pretty significantly, and then he won't be that good at mid. He'll eventually fall down. Zed, without a doubt, is the premier assassin mid laners. So that's mostly because Zed's more of a range champ than a melee champ. Like, he can farm from range. He scales very well. Like, late game, he has, like, super low cooldowns. I would definitely recommend playing a scaling setup on this guy. Like, I think playing TP Conqueror or Ignite Conqueror is much better than playing something like Electrocute. It just feels like you have, like, way more pressure. And I think going the scaling bruiser builds are much better than playing, like, the flat pen lethality builds. The ability to scale is obviously super nice, and there's a lot of these champs that, like, can't pressure you that well 1v1. Like, Zed deals pretty well into a lot of these champs here, which is super, super nice. I think that you can also pick him kind of early because he has played jungle a lot, so you get a lot of flex pick value here, but in theory, he is better used as a counter pick, right? But again, like, he is one of the more blindable assassins, and I think a very underrated champion in general, so I'm going to have him very high up on my tier list. Ziggs, I think, is okay. I want to say he's like either a B+ or a B. I think I'll put him B for now, but I could definitely see him being a B+. So the thing with Ziggs is, like, he scales pretty well, and his laning phase is surprisingly good, especially into other mages, but it's just less consistent. Like, once again, it's like, there are champions that have better gank setup. There are champions that have more reliable scaling, more reliable skill shots, and especially late game, similar to something like Xerath and Mel, you can really struggle from your opponents just having dashes or having too much movement speed or whatever, which makes his life really tough. I also think that Ziggs is a champion that kind of needs to snowball. Like, he's a very good acceleration champ. The time Ziggs has been played mid and competitive, I always remember this one game where Knight played Ziggs mid, and they just, like, blew up the entire game early. They had taken something like 6 towers, so, like, all 3 hours and all 3 inners by, like, 16 minutes, and what they'd done is, like, they had just played for an early Herald. This is back when you could take Herald at, like, 8 minutes, and they just used it to, like, start blowing up the map. They, like, rotated Ziggs around everywhere, just getting all the turrets. So he has a lot of value if you can accelerate, but, like, it's hard to secure the grubs on Ziggs because you're not that great an early skirmisher. Herald is now delayed, so you don't get it super early. And obviously, that's also like something that can be coordinated in pro play. That can't really be coordinated in solo queues. So I don't think the champion's that good, but it is kind of underrated. I think if you pair it with lockdown, things like Jarvan, Camille, whatever, you can make life really difficult for mobile carries, especially things that don't have like some form of immunity or like really don't want to build Zhonya or something like that. Almost at the end now, we have Zilean. So Zilean is kind of an OP champ, but like kind of trash at the same time. So if Zilean just spawned in the mid game, I think he'd be pretty good. Like, he's really good against comps that don't have a lot of damage, but they only have like single target damage or they only have a lot of burst. Comps that don't have a lot of AoE, in other words, because it's really getting near the end now. We have Zilean. So Zilean is kind of OP, but like very situationally. So the problem with Zilean is he's a very hard champion to pick. He's super punishable in lane. Like, his laning phase is kind of Malzahar tier. Like, it's very weak. And most of the times you would look to pick Zilean, you'd probably just be better off picking Ori, because like Ori kind of does what Zilean does, maybe not quite as well. Like, she doesn't buff people as well, but she has way more damage. Her scaling is, I'd say, better actually than Zilean's, although Zilean's scaling is somewhat dependent on who's around them. But you can say the same for Ori, right? Like, if you play like Ori Jinx instead of Zilean Jinx, I think it's more likely you win that game with Ori Jinx, just because you're not going to give up as much early, and you have a bit more solo carry potential, whereas Zilean, all your eggs would then be in the Jinx basket. I think Zilean itemization also isn't the best. In the past, you used to actually play like Roa. I think it was Roa. I want to say like ages ago, it was like Roa Luden or something on Zilean. This was like season 7 or season 8 or something. It was very different from now. The problem is you don't really want to go Roa on this champion at the moment because the item itself is just not that good. But at the same time, like, you really need Catalyst to survive lane as a modern day Zilean. Like, if you play Zilean into one of these champs, like, you're really on the clock. Like, your laning phase is going to be bad, and you're definitely getting outscaled late game. So you've got to, like, really take control of the mid game, and I just think that's such a tight win condition, and it just doesn't feel worth it. Like, I've played a lot of Zilean, actually, like, back in the day, and I've played a tiny bit of it recently, and pretty much every time I've picked it, I just wish I'd picked Ori in general. But the champion itself is not bad. You can definitely make it work. It's really good with certain hyper carries, with bruisers, with AD junglers. And if you get a free matchup, it is one of the many options you can go for to grade. But I think Orianna is pretty much just a better version. And the lucky last we have of our mid laners here, we've got Zoe. So Zoe's a pretty good solo queue pick, but also kind of suffers from itemization issues. So, you know, like your typical Zoe build would be something like Luden Horizon, Luden Shatterflame, or whatever. You can play Blackfire, but it just doesn't feel that good. Luden's is not a particularly strong item. You want to play Flat Pen, but again, like, Merc's really good against Zoe. Magic Resist is really strong. She is just one of the champs that can solo queue, or sorry, that can snowball solo queue the hardest. Like, you can get random kills early with Zoe and just go absolutely crazy, but she kind of feels like Katarina, where, like, she sort of needs some, like, random shit to happen. If you're going to play the TP playstyle instead, you definitely can. And actually, she's not bad around stuff like Atacon, but it can also be, like, Zoe's a lot better if you can land some poke before the team fight. Once the actual 5v5 starts, she's not as valuable as something like this. And also her laning phases into other mages, you're really reliant on hitting like a random bubble or getting like, you know, random like balloon pickups to get the right spells and stuff. So it's Zoe's never going to be bad in solo queue. Like, she's just a really good champion for snowballing and carry the game. But I do think it's more inconsistent than a lot of the champions up here, and it's also like quite hard to play. Like it takes a lot of time investment to be good at Zoe. There's also a lot of engaged supports in the meta. Like it's not particularly easy to just like ult forward when there's things like Leonas, Nautiluses, whatever running around. So you can definitely make it worth. It's a super rewarding, super fun champion, but I would recommend more consistent win conditions if you're looking for something to learn. So that's our finished tier list. Before I go on to the blind picks, I'm just going to mention some of the off-meta mids that you can play. I'm not going to list them all because this video is already very, very long, and the thing is, like, you can play so many champs mid. You know, like, there's so much weird shit that can work mid. There's tons of viability. And I'll just be here forever explaining them all. So let's see. I think like Cho'Gath can be good as an option sometimes. Like he's very tanky, works pretty well. You can go for Gragas mid, pretty good into melees, pretty good neutralizer. It's also a flex. Heimer, very, very good versus melees as well. Karma, kind of a weaker version of Ori, I feel like. Much better in support, but does work well with some of the AD junglers. Kennen is pretty good. Splinter got very, very high rank with Kennen mid in Korea. It's kind of a cheese pick. Like, it's very reliant on killing someone early, and it works a lot better if your opponent hasn't played against Kennen before, at least in mid, as you'll probably pick up a kill at level 3 or level 6, but yeah, it's an option. Cassante mid still works. It's definitely better against AP-heavy compositions. You know, like, if you have only one AP mid, and you go something like Kanik early, and then the rest of them are AD, it doesn't work so well, but a tank mid into heavy APs definitely works. You can go Lulu mid. I think, again, Ori's kind of the more consistent version, but it still works for buffing hypercarries or AD junglers. What else do we have? You can kind of play Nocturne mid. I tried a little bit of this recently, and it does have a lot of pressure on the map. You know, you can easily push waves, you can rotate in the rivers, you can gank bot lane a lot, and obviously bot lane is quite important. I think it's important to just pick this in games where you can more easily punish them, right? Like, you want to play against an AD carry that probably doesn't have a dash, or you want to play alongside a bot lane that has a CC or whatever. Quinn is pretty good. Phantasm plays a lot of Quinn. It's kind of similar to Akshan, just like push, run around the map. Kind of cheesy pick, but scales pretty well as well and has a lot of impact on the early game. So yeah, I think Quinn's pretty underrated. Rumble still works mid. He's not amazing, but he has some good pairings, like Rumble Jarvan, Rumble Rel, all go pretty hard. Definitely better against melee champs, but against the mobile range champs with setup, it can definitely work. Seraphine, I think, is kind of underrated as a mid. Like, it really plays into the 5v5 scaling. It's a flex pick. The downside of Seraphine mid is you give a free lane to whatever you're playing against, and there are mid laners that scale even better than Seraphine. But, like, yeah, it can be a really good neutralizer. It's quite good into compositions that lack damage. Like, if you're playing in something like Ahri Gen and they just don't have the DPS to get through, you know, big shields and big heals, then I think Seraphine is actually pretty slept on. Sivir mid's not bad. I played a little bit of Sivir mid. It's surprisingly a pretty good AD mid. You can neutralize most matchups just by wave clearing. Sivir scales pretty well. I think it's best against things that aren't looking to skirmish. Like, you probably don't want to play it into an assassin because you don't want to get dragged into those skirmishes. But into mages, it can actually work quite well, especially the ones that don't have a whole lot of wave clear themselves. Sion and Singed, both kind of greasy tank counterpicks. You can look to play them Singed into a mobile. You can look to play Sion into low DPS teams. Tryndamere, I don't really see Tryndamere played mid often lately. I think it does struggle against anything with a dash or phase rush. But I'm sure there are matchups out there where they can't really punish and you can find ways to snowball. I think that's pretty much it. Maybe you could play Zac mid. Yeah, you can play Zac mid. I mean, he's just another tank, quite good against the mobile mages, especially ones that lack DPS. I also get questions about Zyra a lot lately. Zyra mid is playable, but Zyra is a really good jungler, and I would say she's a better AP carry bot lane than she is a mid laner, because the mage matchups are kind of tough. But I think Zyra's a pretty good champ. The thing is, she's so good in the jungle that it's like, why not just play her jungle? But, you know, again, like AP carry or mid, it's underrated. It can definitely be played. So I think that's it for off meta. Let's go into how I blind pick these days. So I mentioned it at the start of the video. I much prefer going for greedy blinds, going for things where my opponent has to punish me, otherwise I'm just going to scale, and even if I am in a bad matchup, I will still scale regardless. So I think the easiest one to blind pick these days is just Syndra. There are things that can punish you, things like Zed or Akali, but like it's much easier to scale on Syndra compared to these champions. And there definitely are ways you can play them, you know, like for example, keeping the wave on your side, you know, like taking phase rush potentially to run away, building Cosmic second for HP, you can even build Seraph first if you need need it. There are things you can do. So I really like the Syndra blind. If you want kind of the more normal blind, like Ori or Talia are probably your go-tos. Ori is much safer. There's going to be less assassins that can hard punish you, but also there's like a bit less reward in terms of the scaling. Talia is another kind of like greedy pick. There's definitely assassins that can shut you down early, and there might be matchups where you need to play Roa, like Roa Seraph, like versus Fizz maybe, just in order to survive. If you're in a really tough matchup as Talia, that's basically the go-to. The thing is, Roa as an item is definitely not ideal. Like, you want to not go it, I think, if you can. So that's like the punishment for blinding it, but you can definitely make it work. What else is like a kind of decent blind? I mean, I've been using greedy blind Cassio, but I guess it's just like other stuff like this. It depends like how greedy you want to be versus how safe. You know, like the safe champs are things like this, like Ahri, Aurora, Azir, Hwei, you know, things with wave clear, Ori, Syndra, obviously. But, like, you give up some scaling for that. And I find, like, in the current meta, if you're going to play something that doesn't scale, it kind of needs to be used as a counter to make sure you can snowball. If you want to blind pick melees, I'd say, like, Dinah and Zed are both options. Like, both of them are flex picks. Both of them can farm from range, which is kind of nice. Even though Dinah uses mana to farm from range, it's relatively cheap. So it's, like, kind of easy to pull off. Yeah, I think Ambessa is, like, decently blindable. She has gang set up and has a lot of gap closer, but I do think she's probably better as a counter pick. I think that's basically it. I mean, maybe you can blind pick some of the champs down here if you're looking to be greedy, but generally, I mean, it's like I said at the start of the video, I like to go for... I don't care too much about, like, mobility at the moment. I mostly care about how hard I can scale and like how hard I am to punish in terms of like the lane. You know, like if I pick Syndra, how many champs available can punish me while also themselves being like strong in the meta, and there's not a whole lot of options. So maybe I'd ban Zed or something if I were going to pick Syndra every game. Anyway, I think that's it for this video. It ended up longer than I intended, but I hope you guys enjoyed it anyway. I'm going to post some more content soon. If you guys have any questions, again, put them in the comment section below or come check out my Twitch stream. I'll answer there as well, twitch.tv/shocklol. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm sorry I haven't posted in a while. I will maybe make a video explaining that as well. But yeah, thank you guys so much, and I will see you on the next one.